Today's daf is daf Lamed Daled, and we're talking about Klal Yisrael under the leadership of Yeshua crossing the Yarden into the land of Israel. And the waters, of course, had to dry up in order for Klal Yisrael to go through. And the Gemara says, Kevan shenitbelu raglei hakohanim b'mayim, as soon as the feet of the Kohanim reached the water of the Yarden, and now there's a flow, an upstream flow, so the water stopped rushing forward, and that gave the possibility for the Kohanim and following them, the Machne Yisrael, to cross the Yarden. Shenemar ukevo nosei ha'oren ad hayarden v'raglei hakohanim nosei ha'oren nitbelu b'ktzei hamayim. So as soon as the feet of the Kohanim touched the water, that's when we had the miracle, Vayamdu hamayim hayordim milamala. And the waters that would come and rush against Klal Yisrael, now kamu neid echad, they stood up in a vertical position. V'kama govim hayu shalamayim. What was the height of the water? In other words, this vertical pole of water, how high did it get? And here we have Machlokas Tanoim. According to Rabbi Yehuda, Shnemasar mil al Shnemasar mil. Some have the gears of Shnemasar mil. We don't need to talk about the width, but in any event, if we take the Gemara as we have it, then the Orach and the Rocha, both the height and the width of this nade, of this tall pillar of water, was Shnemasar mil. Now, what is the significance? How does Rabbi Yehuda come up with that number, Shnemasar mil? And the reason for that is because Shnemasar mil is equal to the amount of space that's needed for Machne Yisrael to go by. So from the time that Klal Yisrael went into the Yarden, it took them a time period that it would take to walk 12 mil until the last one would pass through the Yarden. So therefore, the Gavo al Mayim was that sheer, so that when the people of Israel would come down, would have passed, and the water would come down, they would have passed, and the water would not rush and kill them. Now, there is a little bit of a problem with the calculation of Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yehuda assumes that Bnei Yisrael crossed the Yarden and Klal Yisrael were in a formation of Machne Yisrael, just as they camped in the Midbar. And we know that the Machne Yisrael extended over an area of 12 by 12 mil. That's a Gemara in Erevin Adaf Nun Hey. So the length of the procession crossing the Yarden was 12 mil, and the time between the entry of the first people into the Yarden and the departure of the last person on the other side of the Yarden is no less than the time it takes for the procession to travel 12 mil. So Rabbi Yehuda therefore calculates that these pillars of wood would advance 12 mil, and at that time, again, assuming, as we'll see in a second, that the water moves at the same speed as the people. Now, here's the problem. It took a little bit longer than this for Bnei Yisrael to cross the Yarden, because the width of the Yarden itself must also be taken into account. And furthermore, Yoshua addressed the people as they were crossing the Yarden, as we'll see in the Hemshech of the Brisa. So presumably when they stood in order to hear the words of Yoshua, that would also take a longer time until they crossed the Yarden. But Rabbi Yehuda is not calculating this because he's using meals. And these factors, even if you took them into calculation, would only add a fraction of a meal. Omalo Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon. So Rabbi Elazar turns to Rabbi Yehuda and he says, L'dvarecha, according to your logic, that the waters were only high enough to negate the shear of Machne Yisrael, I'm going to ask you the following question. Adam Kal or Mayim Kal, which moves faster? The flow of water, the rush of water, or the people walking? Heavy Omer, and certainly the answer would be Mayim Kalin. Water would flow faster than a person would walk. In Canaan, therefore, I have the following objection. According to your understanding that the vertical pillars of water were only 12 mil, then after the water would stand up 12 mil, and then it would begin to again flow, because if not, then the rest of the water that would come afterwards would not have a place to go. So therefore, if the rushing of the water is faster than Adam, than a man, then it comes out that according to this calculation, Bnei Yisrael is still inside the dry area. They haven't yet gotten out of the Yarden, and Boi Mayim, and the rushing water would just simply inundate them. V'shodfen also. Ella, but rather, Rabbi Elazar, Reb Shimon, he says that Malavit Shoyomayim Nigdoshim, it would gather together as a pillar, v'olam, and it would climb, keeping agabi, keeping waves upon waves, ulamot al gabi ulamot, yeser mishlosh meos mil. That's an amazing height. And he says, me'akarkat hanonim ein yoser misholosh parsos, sholosh meos mil, hen yoser mishivim parsos. So from the ground until the clouds is really 3 parsos, where shlosh meos mil is equal to 70 parsos. And it's clear here that the pillars of water climbed above the highest of clouds, so they could be seen throughout the globe. And therefore, he says, yes, mishlosh meos mil, acharo osam kol malchei mizrach u'mayrach. Right, all the kings of the west and the east could see the pillar going up. And this we see in the pasuk in Yoshua Perkei. It says, "Vayich lishmoa kol malchi amori asher be'ever yarden yoma, kol malchi aknani asher al hayom, asher hovish Hashem esmei hayarden mipnei bnei Yisrael ad Avram." So let's see what the English translation of hovish is. He says here, hovish is miloshin yovesh, to dry up. Esmei Yarden b'nei Bnei Yisrael at Avram. So the water of the Yarden dried up in order to allow Bnei Yisrael to cross. Vayimas levavam. And they were overwhelmed by fear. V'lo haya bam od ruach. They didn't have any confidence, any spirit. They were overwhelmed by pachad, he says. The af Rochav azona amro. It's very similar to what Rochav had said to Pinchas and Kalev, the 2 shluchei Yoshua, the spies of Yoshua, regarding the Yamsuf, the Kriyas Yamsuf, Kishamanu. We heard Asher Hovish Hashem Esmei Yamsuf. HaKadosh Baruch Hu dried up the waters of the Red Sea. Mipneichem b'tzeischem mitzrayim. Uksiv, and in the pasuk it says, "Vanishma vayimas levavenu v'lo kama od ruach beish mipneichem ki Hashem Elokeichem hu Elokim b'shamayim v'mal ha'aretz mitochas." Now it's interesting that the pasuk and the statement of Rachav is Vanishma Vayimas Levavenu. So the question is, what does Vanishma mean? And some say that Vanishma means the people who were around at the time of Kriyas Yamsuf, they actually saw the miracle. We only heard about the miracle. But that fear that when they saw the miracle, that impacted on our generation as well, even though we didn't see the miracle, but we heard about the miracle. And the Maharshal points out that the reason why the Brisa quotes this statement of Rachav is to show that there has to be, some sort of a direct knowledge about the miracle in order to instill fear in the hearts of the peoples of the world. And that took place at the time of Yoshua, when they saw, according to Rabbi Elazar, Reb Shimon's understanding, the vertical pillar of Mayim go all the way above the cloud so they could see it throughout, as the Pasuk testifies. And similarly, the Maharshal points out, at the time of Kriyas Yamsuf, water split throughout the entire globe. If a person had a cup, receptacle, then the water would split inside the receptacle. So everyone was aware of this great miracle. Now the Pasuk in Yoshua tells us that Akohanim Nosei Aron Omdim B'soch Hayarden Atom Kol Hadover Asher Tziva Hashem Es Yoshua L'daber Al. And that which Moshe Rabbeinu, with that which HaKadosh Baruch Hu commanded Yoshua to speak to the people, that's going to be passed on by Yoshua to the people of Israel while they're in the dry land of the Yarden. As the Brisa continues, Odom by Yarden, Amalem Yoshua de'u al ma atem over Yarden. There's a condition. Why is it that God is generating this great miracle so that you could pass through the Yarden? Almanas, the condition is shetorishu, that you will expel el es yoshvei ha'aretz mipnechem. Shenemar, as the pasuk says in Bamidbar Lamed Gimel, Varashtem es kol yoshvei ha'aretz mipnechem. So you will have to just exile the people in the land, because now their sins had reached that stage where Hashem wanted to vomit them forth from the land. And Yoshua says to the people, Imatem osim kain, if you accept upon yourself to expel the nations, mutav, that's good, v'im lav, but if you don't do so, boin mayim, v'shotfim osi chem, the waters that are standing now in a pillar form, they will, miraculously, they will then fall and crush us and inundate us. What is osi chem and not oschem? Osi v'eschem. This is the principle of Kol Yisrael, Arevim Zeluzeh. And therefore even Yoshua would be inundated by the waters. So in the English translation, he writes, on the condition that you will drive out the inhabitants of the land. And he adds that in the note here, at the time of the crossing of the Yarden, Hashem stipulated that he's taking the children of Israel into the land, conditional on their driving out the 7 nations that inhabit the land. Now, the people of Israel had already been commanded by Moshe Rabbeinu that on the day that they crossed the Yarden, they would set up 12 stones corresponding to the 12 Shvatim in the Yarden. And that's a pasuk in Dvarim Chav Zayin, Vayom Bayomahu, Asher Tavru Es HaYarden, El Ha'aretz Asher Hashem Elokecha Nosein Lach, V'hakemoso Lecha Avonim Gedolos, V'sadet Oso B'sid. And the pasuk V'hakemoso Lecha means in the Yarden, and then you will remove the stones and transport them and build them as a mizbeach on Har Evel. And afterwards, you would take those stones and relocate them in the Gilgal. And all this is fulfilled as testified in Sefer Yoshua Perek Dalet. Odom b'Yarden, Amalem Yoshua. Now Yoshua had appointed 12 people whose job it was, even before they passed through the Yarden, to be in charge of these 12 Avonim. And he commanded them, Harimu lachem ish even achas al shichmo, Each person will carry on his shoulder one stone. We'll see the weight of the stone soon. L'mispar shivtei b'nei Yisrael. It corresponds to the 12 shvatim of Israel. And they laid down these stones in the Yarden underneath what's called the Meitzav Raglei HaKohanim. Uksiv l'man tia zos os b'kirbechem ki yish'alem v'neichem ochalem ha'mo avonim ha'elu lachem is v'amarto lahem asher nichrasu mimei hayarden mipnei oren bris Hashem b'ovro b'yarden nichrasu mehayarden v'hoyu ha'avonim elu zikar l'pnei Yisrael at olam sima l'bonim sha'avru avos es hayarden. So Yeshua says to the people, every man must raise one stone on his shoulder, corresponding to the number of tribes of Israel. And this will be a sign in your midst when your children ask tomorrow, what is the meaning of these stones? You will respond, it's a sign for the children that their fathers had crossed the Yarden in miraculous fashion. Odom Bayarden, the Brisa continues, Amalem Yeshua says to the 12 people who had prepared the stones, Se'ulachem mizeh b'toch hayarden, mimatzav raglei HaKohanim. And the translation here is the following: carry for yourselves from here, from within the Yarden, for the station of the feet of the Kohanim. So he translates Meitzav as matzav, like a situation or a station. Malon is a station. Asher tolinu bo halayl. Bring them across with you. Set them in the lodging place, the station where they lodged, where you will lodge on this night. He says here in the footnote, based on the Rashash and Rashi, that there was a second set of stones which were carried to Mount Avol, and then following that to Gilgal, where the Jews lodged at night. At Gilgal, these stones were erected in a monument. So the Jews lifted actually two sets of 12 stones from the riverbed. One set was placed in the river at the edge of the water, at the place where the Kohanim were carrying the Aron had stood when the Jews crossed the river. The other set of stones was lifted from the place where the Kohanim stood and brought to Har Avol, where they were used to erect a Mizbeach. They were then plastered, and the Torah was inscribed on them. That same day, they were dismantled, taken to Gilgal, where they used to erect a monument. So the Brisa is referring to the stones that were placed in the river, which were to serve as an everlasting memorial for the Jews to commemorate the great miracle God wrought by splitting the Yarden. The Brisa continues. And now the Gemara is analyzing the Brisa. Yochol bechol malon malon. You might think that they should carry the stones with them to every lodging place where they were lodged. Talmud Lomar asher tolinu bo halayla, on this night. Rabbi Yehuda Abba Chalafta v'Rabbi Eliezer ben Masya v'Chananya ben Chachinoi amdu al oson avonim v'shiarum kol achas v'yaska shkula ke'arboim sa. So this whole group of Chachamim examined the stones, and they estimated that each one measured about 40 sa. A sa is a measure of volume. 40 sa is 3 cubic amos, which is between 10.125 and 24 cubic feet, depending on the views of various achronim. It is not clear whether the Brisa means that the stones themselves measured 40 sa, or their weight was equal to 40 sa of water. In any case, the stones were extremely heavy, weighing several hundred pounds. The fact that one man was able to carry such an enormous burden shows the great strength of the Jews that those days possessed. So in the Masechet translates the Arboim saw as a sheer midas hanofach, nefach, meaning the volume. Ugmiri, the Chachamim had a tradition, de teuna de madle inish lekatfe, the weight that a person can carry onto his shoulders without any help from his friend is tilta de teune havi, is only 1/3 of the weight that he's able to carry on his shoulders if others will help put the burden on his shoulder. So there's always going to be a ratio of 1 to 3. So therefore it comes out that if a person was carrying 40 sa and he places the 40 sa on his shoulders, al yidei siyua, if he would have someone else help him place it on his shoulders, he can carry 120 sa, since the ratio is 1 to 3, mikana to machashev li eshkol. So all this is an introduction to the next part of the Gemara, where the Gemara is going to measure the cluster of grapes that was carried by the Meraglim when they turned to Eretz Yisrael for the purpose of speaking Lashon Hara about Eretz Yisrael. And we're going to come to the conclusion soon that 8 of the Meraglim were needed to carry 1 cluster of grapes. And we assume further that each one would be Messiah, the other one, in lifting it up. Now, why 8? Because Kalev and Yoshua were not part of this. They knew what the intention of the other Meraglim were by carrying this cluster of grapes, this Eshkol Novim. And then we needed 2 of the Meraglim to carry other fruits, rimonim and te'enim, pomegranates and figs. So now we make a cheshbon of the eshkol. Shenemar. Pasuk says, Vayisa'u bamot bishnayim. And they carried it on a pole by 2. Now, mimashma shenemar kamot, bamot, if it says bamot, that's all it has to say. Right? You didn't have to add the word shnayim. Eini yodea shebeshnayim. Do I not know from the word bamot that there are 2 meraglim? Because usually when you carry it with a mot, it's 2 people that are carrying the mot on 2 ends. So there's a pole, and at 2 ends, people are carrying that which is being suspended in the pole. I certainly know that it takes 2 people. And also the pasuk says Vayisa'u, which is in plural. And they carried. Is matamalo bishnayim, bishnei motos. It took 2 poles to carry 1 cluster of grapes. And now Rabbi Yitzchak comes to explain that since it was obvious that the Meraglim were carrying peiros, as far as Rimon and Teina, as we said earlier, all they needed was 2 of the Meraglim to carry the Rimon and the Teina. Yoshua and Kalev were not carrying it all, and the Mefarshim speak about why they didn't take part in carrying. And basically it's because they didn't want to be part of this Lashon Hara. So you're left with 8 Meraglim. And you have 2 motos, 2 poles. And on each pole, there were 2 people holding on and carrying at the ends of the pole. So Rabbi Yitzchak says that the carrying of the eshkol was turtane which means a masa hanisa al yidei shnei motos, kasher kol mot achuz bidei shnei meraglim, echad mikol tzad. Okay, so that's called turtane. So you have two meraglim, one on each side, carrying two motos. Uturtani de turtani. And the masa elyon zen nisa al yedei od masa tachton shegam bo hayu shnei matos sholchu balakson tachas shnei matos elyon. So it's two motos and another two motos. So if you have two motos with two meraglim on each side, that already gives you four. And if you have another group of two motos elyonim that would help carry the masa, then you're left with, you have a total of 8. He has a picture of it here in the Masechet. So you've got poles going this way and that way, carrying okay. So we have 10 meraglim carrying the fruits. 8 of the meraglim are carrying the eshkol together. And each one can carry a masa, we said, of mea v'esrim sa. So therefore, the mishkal of the weight of the eshkol was 960 sa, massive. He calls it a load under a load. And he says, Rabbi Yitzchak arrives at the conclusion that Yoshua and Kalev did not carry any fruit. Of the 10 remaining spies, one carried pomegranate, one carried the fig. This left 8 people to carry the cluster of grapes. Now, if the verse is understood literally, that only one pole was used to carry the cluster of grapes, it would be impossible to explain the need for 8 people to carry this cluster. However, once the Gemara interprets the verse to refer to 2 poles rather than 2 people, Rabbi Yitzchak was able to build on that and say that there were 2 sets of poles requiring 8 people. The cluster of grapes was placed on 2 parallel poles, which were carried by 4 people. 2 other poles, also carried by 4 people, were placed diagonally underneath these 2 poles in the shape of an X. In this way, the weight of the cluster was distributed among 8 people. Yoshua v'Kalev lo nasu klum. They didn't participate in carrying the cluster. Ivois ema, according to one explanation, Mishum dechashivi, it was below their dignity to carry the payroll. Ivois ema shelo hoyibosa eitza. And the second interpretation is they understood that the Ratzon HaMeraglim in the Siyas HaPeres was Lahavi Dibas HaAretz. They didn't want to have any part of that. And now, after we had learned earlier the Machlok Shin Rav Yehuda and Rav Elazar Rav Shimon about how high the pillars of water reached, Rav Yehuda says 12 mil and Rav Elazar Rav Shimon says 300 mil. Now, the Gemara wants to explain that the Amoraim actually had a machlokas about how to interpret Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon Pligi Ba, Rabbi Ami, Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha. That's where we're up to now.